They ambushed me with lawyers while my grandfather's body was barely cold. I'm Amber, 29, and last month, my grandfather Harold left me everything: his estate, his business, his legacy. Over $2 million worth of real assets and irreplaceable history. The morning after the funeral, my mother Patricia sent a single text: family meeting. Be at the house. 9 a.m. I walked into my childhood home, the same front porch where I used to trace chalk suns and hopscotch patterns, and everything felt off. Too clean. Too rehearsed. My mother stood at the center of the living room in a silk blouse she only wore for serious occasions. Her husband Craig was beside her, nursing a coffee he didn't make. My half-siblings, Rachel and Jason, hovered by the fireplace like extras in a bad stage play. And then there were the two men I didn't recognize: expensive suits, briefcases resting neatly by their polished shoes. My mother smiled, tight, cold, triumphant. "Amber," she said. "Meet our lawyers." I didn't sit down. I didn't say a word. Because I already knew. They weren't here to grieve. They were here to take. And I wasn't prepared for what happened next. My grandfather wasn't just a man with a successful chain of hardware stores. He was the only adult in my life who ever looked me in the eye and saw more than a burden. He built his company from nothing. When I was little, I would stare at the framed photo in my room, him standing in front of his first storefront, sun in his eyes, pride in his stance. He taught me how to read inventory reports before I could parallel park. He once told me, "Nothing worth having comes easy, Amber. And the world will always test you on that." My mother never understood that kind of wisdom. Her relationship with money was emotional, erratic, demanding. I'd watch her on the phone with credit card companies, crying one second, yelling the next. She chased validation in shopping bags, wore new brands like Armor, and blamed my grandfather every time reality crashed in. My stepfather Craig didn't help, a man whose main occupation was avoiding confrontation and blaming the economy. They refinanced our house so many times I lost track. When I got accepted to college with a full tuition offer contingent on covering my own room and board, Grandpa offered to help. My mother found a way to siphon that too. When I told him I'd taken out loans, he just shook his head. After that, he started visiting me at the bookstore where I worked, pretending to browse, slipping me cash in envelopes. "This is between us," he'd whisper. That was Grandpa. Quiet generosity. No grandstanding. When he got sick, I visited the hospital every week. On one of those visits, as machines beeped steadily around us, he looked at me with something deeper than love. "Patricia doesn't understand what money is. It's not just paper, Amber. It's security. It's opportunity. You understand." He squeezed my hand. "I've made arrangements. When the time comes, stand your ground. Promise me." I did. I just never expected to be standing on that ground alone. In that living room, my mother wasted no time. "These are the estate attorneys," she announced. "We'll be restructuring Harold's assets. It's better for the family if the business remains centralized under my oversight." I didn't respond. She waved a packet in the air like she was auctioning off old furniture. "Just sign the transfer forms. You'll be taken care of." One of the lawyers stepped forward with practiced detachment. "It's a simple reassignment. Your grandfather's wishes were generous, but with your mother's long-standing involvement in the family business, it's logical she assumes operational authority." I cut him off. "My mother hasn't stepped foot in a store in 20 years. She once tried to return a hammer because it had too much metal in it." He blinked, startled. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Amber, don't be dramatic. This isn't personal. It's about responsibility." "You're, what? A part-time manager at a co-op bookstore?" That was when I realized they had never really seen me. Not once. They saw what they needed. A compliant signature. A silent heir. A weak spot they could pressure until it cracked. But I didn't crack. I looked at every person in that room, including my mother, and I said nothing. Just placed the unsigned papers back on the coffee table and walked out. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing Grandpa sitting across from me, the way he did when he first explained compound interest or taught me how to read the fine print on a lease. I could still hear him say, "They'll come for it. And you have to be smarter than them." Not louder. Just smarter. And smarter meant quiet. Patient. Strategic. Because my mother wasn't finished. And neither was I. Next morning, I found something waiting on my doorstep, a certified envelope. Inside was a formal notice. Patricia was petitioning the court to have the will declared invalid due to undue influence. She was trying to erase me. But I had more than his signature. I had the stories, the documents, and the truth. And I was done being the quiet one. They didn't just want the inheritance, they wanted to rewrite who I was in his story. The legal petition arrived folded in stiff legal language, thick with phrases like mental incapacity and coercion, all aimed at discrediting the one relationship in this family that had ever been built on honesty. According to them, I'd manipulated a dying man into leaving me everything. A man who raised me on spreadsheets and early morning store visits, who taught me to balance a ledger before I had a checking account. That man. Manipulated. I sat on the floor of my apartment for nearly an hour, holding the papers. Not reading them. Just holding. As if the weight of the document might change its contents if I waited long enough. But it didn't. What struck me wasn't the betrayal that I had braced for. It was the erasure. The calculated way they tried to blot out every Saturday I spent with Grandpa in his office. Every whispered conversation in hospital rooms. Every time he tucked a receipt into a folder and handed it to me with a look that meant, "Remember this." They wanted his legacy, but they didn't want his lessons. And they certainly didn't want the version of him that loved me. The week that followed blurred into errands that shouldn't have felt so heavy, updating the store's license records, confirming accounting transitions, answering calls from vendors. One man, Ed from the Iowa location, asked how Harold was holding up. I had to tell him he'd passed away. His voice cracked. He always treated us like partners. Not employees. That's rare, you know? I knew. The stores still ran. They were still his. Still breathing in their quiet way. But the air around them had changed. Not because he was gone. But because of what my family was trying to do in his absence. At night, I couldn't sleep. I would stare at the boxes Grandpa had left me, his personal files, his handwritten notes, letters. There were binders with color-coded tabs, notes in the margins of old business magazines, envelopes marked Deed, Jasper County, and photos I'd never seen before, him at ribbon cuttings, shaking hands with town mayors, standing with groups of smiling employees in branded t-shirts. One envelope was different. Heavy, sealed with a wax stamp. My name on the front, in his shaky cursive. Inside was a letter. He wrote about legacy. About trust. About the weight of holding something others will never understand. "You'll be the only one who sees the whole picture," he wrote. "That's both a gift and a burden. Use it wisely." And then the last line, scrawled almost illegibly, "They'll try to shame you for standing alone. But don't forget, I chose you for a reason." I held that letter like it was oxygen. Because I needed it. My mother had started making calls. A former board member from Grandpa's early days, who now ran a regional logistics firm, emailed me to say Patricia had reached out, claiming the transition plan was still under review. She was vague, he said, but aggressive. She hinted that I was overwhelmed and not aligned with the family's direction. I knew that language. It was the vocabulary of erasure. That slow, professional smiling kind of destruction. It was what she always did. Growing up, Patricia made sure no conversation about Grandpa happened without her permission. She controlled the narrative, who got to speak, who was too young to understand. If I brought up something he'd taught me, she'd laugh and say I misremembered. If I showed her numbers I'd double-checked for him, she dismissed them as guesses. I learned, over time, that my place in the family was tolerated only when it didn't contradict her version of things. But Grandpa had made space for me. He'd sit across from me in that worn leather chair, pen tapping his notepad, and actually listen. He'd ask follow-up questions. Encourage me to challenge him. Sometimes I think he enjoyed it, the pushback, the sparring. It kept him sharp. And it made me brave. Now, I needed that bravery again. Because my mother wasn't working alone. Rachel, my half-sister, had posted on social media a carefully worded note about healing from family greed and protecting the family business. Jason, her younger brother and Patricia's favorite, reshared it with a caption that read, "Some things should stay in the family." All of the family. The comments flooded in. Sympathy. Confusion. Passive-aggressive support. I said nothing publicly. But I started organizing. I knew my mother's patterns. She moved fast, got others to speak for her, and counted on shame to keep people quiet. But I also knew how to read her financial tells, the little cracks in her strategy that showed she was bluffing. Like the fact that she'd already tried to move funds from the shared trust into her personal account and had been flagged by the estate's trustee. Or the fact that she'd sent a private investigator to one of the remote stores in Missouri, a man who asked the assistant manager who really runs this place before offering to consult on management restructuring. They were trying to build a case. That much was clear. And I wasn't going to give them one. So I started gathering. Every note Grandpa ever left me. Every signed paper. Every voicemail, every photo. I cataloged everything. I pulled bank statements. I made digital backups. I had the will, the deed transitions, the medical records from the last few months of his life, every document that proved he was of sound mind and clear intent. This wasn't just about money. It was about memory. And I was the only one who remembered him without filters. The pressure mounted. My cousin Laura, one of the few family members who had stayed neutral until now, called me out of the blue. "Your mom says you're being irrational," she said softly. "She says you're isolating yourself. Are you okay?" I wanted to ask, has she ever asked if I was okay before? Instead, I said, "I'm exactly as okay as I need to be." That seemed to silence her. But I knew I'd lost her too. Grief is lonely. But betrayal, that's something else. It hollows you out in slow circles. I kept moving anyway. At night, I'd sit by the boxes, rereading Grandpa's notes. By day, I met with the estate attorney and forwarded every communication to him, dates, timestamps, email headers. I wasn't emotional. I was methodical. Like Grandpa taught me. Because the hearing was coming. Patricia had filed a motion to contest the will. A formal court appearance was scheduled. I would have to testify. So would she. The lawyer, Mr. Beckett, leaned across his desk during our meeting and said quietly, "This will get personal. They'll go after character, not facts." I said, "Then I'll make sure the facts speak louder." He studied me for a moment. "You remind me of your grandfather," he finally said. Right down to the stubborn silence. That silence was my armor now. Because they didn't want a fight, not really. They wanted a collapse. They wanted me to crumble, to retreat, to hand it over and disappear into family mythology as the unstable niece who couldn't handle pressure. But I'd been built for pressure. And the real confrontation hadn't even begun. Not yet. They didn't just try to break me, they tried to convince everyone I was already broken. 2 weeks before the hearing, the pressure turned surgical. First came the sudden flood of concern, text messages from extended relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years, all asking the same thing in slightly different tones. Was I okay? Did I need to talk? Maybe take a step back and think about what Grandpa would have wanted for the family. None of them asked what he wanted for me. It was coordinated, down to the hashtags. Rachel posted a photo of Grandpa's old desk with the caption, "He built it for us." I hope we honor that. A vague, passive attempt at moral high ground, just enough for people to fill in the blanks and draw their own conclusions, always in her favor. My inbox filled with noise. Cousins, childhood friends, even a former teacher emailed me links to vague think pieces about inheritance disputes and family cohesion. One even added, "Just food for thought, Amber. Hope you're not losing sleep over this." I didn't respond. Silence has weight when used properly. But inside, I was beginning to feel the cracks. Not the kind that shatter, the kind that spread quietly along your internal structure. Stress fractures of identity. The isolation wasn't physical. It was emotional. Strategic. I would walk into familiar spaces, the store in Cedar Rapids, the cafe Grandpa used to frequent, and sense the shift in energy. Conversations quieted when I entered. Smiles tightened. Some employees, unsure what they'd heard or read, began addressing me with unnatural formality, as if waiting for me to correct some perceived overstep. Doubt spreads faster than truth. Mr. Beckett called one evening with an update. Patricia had submitted a letter of character reference from an old family acquaintance, a retired school principal who hadn't seen me since I was 14. The letter described me as aloof, highly intelligent but emotionally distant, and suggested a history of anxiety that may impair judgment under duress. I hung up the phone slowly, my hand resting on the kitchen counter like it might tip sideways. It wasn't the lie that hurt. It was the accuracy twisted just enough to suggest instability. Because yes, I had anxiety. I always had. Quiet, high-functioning, barely visible anxiety that I managed with discipline and solitude. Grandpa had understood that. He never tried to fix it. He just gave me structure. Logic. A calm hand on the wheel when mine trembled. Now they were turning that trait, that inner wiring, into a weapon. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. But that night, I couldn't bring myself to eat. I sat at the table, staring at the untouched bowl of lentils I'd made out of habit, not hunger. I hadn't seen my mother since the ambush at the house. She hadn't tried to call, only sent messages through others. But I knew her hand was behind every move. When I was 12, she accused me of forging a signature on a school permission slip because she forgot to sign it. I had brought it home, placed it on the counter, reminded her twice. But when the teacher sent it back and signed, she blamed me. "You're always trying to make me look like a bad parent," she'd said then. That memory returned now, uninvited but sharp. She had always been the victim in her own story, a misunderstood matriarch carrying the burden of an ungrateful daughter. But what she couldn't tolerate was irrelevance. Grandpa's will made her irrelevant. So now, her goal wasn't just to take the money. It was to recenter herself as the protagonist. Even if that meant burning every bridge between us. The next escalation came quietly, a voicemail from a woman named Camille, an HR rep from the regional branch of the hardware company. Her tone was overly cheerful. "Hi Amber, just wanted to confirm some of the recent rumors about operational transitions. There's been talk about a possible sale or merger? Some of the store managers are worried about layoffs. Just trying to get clarity. Thanks." There was no sale. No merger. But my mother had started whispering. She'd always known how to stir unrest without leaving fingerprints. I called Ed, the manager who'd worked under Grandpa for 27 years. His voice sounded strained. "People are nervous," he admitted. "Patricia said you might shut down underperforming locations. That you're planning to bring in consultants who'll gut what Harold built." I closed my eyes. "I'm not," I said quietly. "I believe you," he replied. "But not everyone knows you like I do." And that was the problem. They didn't know me. Not really. Not the way Grandpa did. I wasn't charismatic like Rachel. I wasn't likable in a conventional sense. I didn't smile at the right moments or reassure people with empty phrases. I wasn't built for performance. But I was built for precision. And right now, I needed someone else who understood that. So I called Olivia. She'd been my roommate in college, a legal studies major turned estate lawyer, now based in Des Moines. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years beyond the occasional birthday text. She answered after the second ring. Amber? I hesitated. Hey, I said. Can I ask you something complicated? There was a pause. Then, you're in trouble. Not exactly, I said. But I might be if I don't get ahead of this. I told her everything. Not the dramatized version. The clean facts. The manipulations. The smear campaign. The petition. The subtle, relentless gaslighting. She didn't interrupt. She never had. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. I know someone who can help, she said. He specializes in contested wills. He's discreet. Surgical. And he doesn't blink around family politics. She gave me a name. A contact. And then she said, you're doing everything right. But you need to stop playing defense. That stuck with me. Because she was right. I'd been reacting, not acting. Grandpa would have hated that. So I met with the lawyer. Quietly. Thoroughly. I handed over documents, correspondence, timelines. Every piece of evidence Patricia might distort, every false trail she'd already laid. And then I drafted a letter of my own. Not to her. Not to the public. To the estate's trustee. And to the board Grandpa had established years ago to preserve the company's values. People who respected him. People who had known me, not socially, but professionally. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was factual. Precise. Backed with documentation. And it ended with this line. I will not dismantle what my grandfather built to protect the ego of someone who never helped him build it. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a statement of alignment. And in my heart, I knew Grandpa would have approved. Because while they were busy fighting for control of his legacy, I was the only one preserving its soul. And soon, I would make that known. I stopped defending myself the moment I realized they weren't confused, they were complicit. The day the board convened, I arrived 30 minutes early. Not because I was anxious, though I was, but because I needed to sit in that conference room alone before they did. I needed to feel what he felt. The leather chairs. The heavy wood table. The air, always faintly scented with pine cleaner and tension. Grandpa had led every meeting from the head seat, leaning forward with those tired but perceptive eyes, index finger tapping softly as others talked in circles. I sat in that same chair, folded my hands exactly as he used to, and waited. When the others arrived, 7 men and women from across the company's lifetime, they each greeted me with that careful, polite neutrality I'd come to expect. Not hostile. Not friendly. Just professionally cautious. They'd all received my letter. But letters were easy to ignore. Now, they would hear my voice. I stood and spoke with a stillness that surprised even me. Not one raised word. Not a single emotional stumble. I walked them through the facts, the timeline, the documents, the legal manipulations, and most importantly, my grandfather's vision. I reminded them of the values he'd built this company on. Efficiency, transparency, employee dignity. Not legacy as decoration, but as living principle. When I finished, no one applauded. That wasn't what I wanted. But I saw it, a shift. Small, unspoken, but present. Recognition. I didn't need them to like me. I just needed them to remember who they respected. Outside, Olivia was waiting. She hadn't needed to come with me, but she had. Did it land? She asked quietly. I nodded. I think it started to. We didn't say more. She knew better than to fill the silence. That's what I appreciated most about her. She didn't try to comfort what she didn't understand. She just showed up. That night, I went back to my apartment and opened the last box Grandpa had left me. I'd been saving it, almost afraid of what it might contain. Inside were 3 ledgers, handbound, well-worn, spanning decades. One was labeled simply, margins. Another, mistakes. The third, lessons. It was the third that broke me. Each page held a short line, sometimes no more than 6 or 7 words, scribbled in his distinct, slanted handwriting. Observations, reminders, sometimes regrets. Trust is fragile, but clarity is armor. Never confuse noise for truth. Pride built alone is easy to steal. I copied that last one and taped it above my desk. Because that's what Patricia had done for years. She built pride from proximity, never labor. She called herself the daughter of a business mogul, not the daughter of a man who ate dinner out of vending machines his first 3 years to keep the lights on. And now, she wanted to erase everything inconvenient about his legacy. Including me. But I had moved past grief. I was building something harder. Resolve. The court date loomed. Mr. Beckett warned me to expect performative concern. He said Patricia would likely present herself as the wounded daughter, the bypassed heir. Her legal team would emphasize emotional proximity. The narrative was already in motion, that I, the dutiful but emotionally detached granddaughter, had taken advantage of a dying man's vulnerability. I didn't correct him. I just asked for time off work and rearranged my calendar. Because I was done playing their character. Let them think I was cold. Let them think I was calculating. They had no idea what kind of fire calmness could hide. I started preparing not just for court, but for confrontation. I contacted each of Grandpa's former partners, men and women who had served beside him when the company had only 5 locations. I asked them for statements, not character references, but operational testimony. Facts. Dates. Conversations witnessed. Memos signed. Most of them obliged. One woman, Lenora Jenkins, sent me a letter she'd kept in her desk for over 20 years, a handwritten thank you from Grandpa that mentioned me by name. She's got it, he'd written. Whatever it is, that grit thing. I hope I live long enough to see her run this place. That letter was now part of the file Olivia was compiling. We were building our own narrative. Not just in defense. In truth. The night before the hearing, I drove to the Cedar Rapids location. The flagship store. The original. I walked the aisles slowly, running my fingers along the metal shelves. One of the employees, Mark, who had worked there since I was 17, nodded at me as I passed. No matter what happens tomorrow, he said, you belong here. I didn't reply. Just smiled. It was enough. At the register, someone had taped an old photo of Grandpa, him standing next to me, both of us holding paint cans and laughing at something neither of us could remember now. I stared at it for a long time. And then I left. Back home, I wrote one more letter. Not to the board. Not to the trustee. To Patricia. I didn't send it. But I wrote it. It was short. I know what you're afraid of. You were never chosen. Not by him. Not by me. You taught me shame. He taught me purpose. I choose him. I folded it, sealed it, and placed it in the same envelope Grandpa had used for his final letter to me. Not because I needed to send it. But because I needed to say it. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. I ironed my shirt. Packed my binder. And before I turned out the light, I looked at the quote above my desk one last time. Pride built alone is easy to steal. But this wasn't built alone. And they were about to learn that. Because tomorrow, I would stop being quiet. They expected me to flinch. I didn't. I walked into that courtroom like I already knew how the story ended. It wasn't arrogance. It was preparedness, the kind you wear like a second skin when you've spent your entire life being underestimated. The room was colder than I imagined, more sterile, less cinematic. No one raised voices. No one wept. Just soft murmurs and dry legal exchanges beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights. Patricia was already seated when I entered, flanked by her attorneys, one of them flipping pages, the other checking his watch. She wore navy, her serious mother shade. Hair pinned. Pearls. Controlled elegance. She didn't look at me. The judge arrived, a woman in her late 50s, calm and sharp, the kind of presence that instantly narrowed the air in the room. She called the hearing to order with the same tone someone might use to confirm an appointment. Efficient. No indulgence. I took my seat beside Mr. Beckett, who nodded once and slid a notepad toward me with 2 words at the top, "Stay still." The petition Patricia had filed alleged undue influence, claiming my grandfather was not of sound mind when he revised his will. The revised version, the one that left me everything, was inconsistent with his prior verbal intentions and therefore, according to her attorney, required closer scrutiny. They spoke like surgeons. Slicing with precision. Her lead attorney, Mr. Walling, rose and began his opening remarks. He painted Patricia as the dutiful daughter, estranged not by choice but by circumstance, sidelined by a granddaughter who infiltrated the elder's trust during a vulnerable period. His voice was calm, almost apologetic. No accusation ever sounded like one. He said, "Our position is not to question the granddaughter's intentions, but rather to protect the legacy of a man who may have been misled." I said nothing. When it was our turn, Beckett rose without a binder. Just one sheet of paper in his hand. He said, "We will demonstrate, with evidence and testimony, that the decedent acted with full legal and mental capacity. We will also show a long-standing, documented pattern of trust between Mr. Harold Mercer and his granddaughter, Amber Mercer. Furthermore, we will reveal that the petitioner's financial history includes repeated attempts to leverage Mr. Mercer's estate for personal gain, dating back more than a decade." He paused. "Legacy isn't built on sentiment. It's built on decisions." The judge nodded slightly. "Proceed." The next 2 hours were a blur of technical language and document citations. Witnesses were called. Olivia had secured them herself, 3 former board members, 1 former estate planner, and a nurse who'd cared for Grandpa in his final weeks. Each of them testified to his clarity. His intentions. His affection for me. One, a man named Darnell who had worked with Grandpa for 30 years, said, "Harold didn't do anything halfway. If he changed his will, it's because he knew exactly what he was doing." Patricia shifted in her seat. Her team pushed back, of course. They questioned the timing, hinted that I had isolated him, subtly implying that my visits were less about care and more about control. The judge asked one question during that exchange: was the decedent ever deemed medically incompetent at the time of the will's execution? The answer was no. Then they called me. I stood and crossed the room slowly. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted every step to be deliberate. I took my seat. Swore the oath. Folded my hands. Walling leaned forward, too casual. He said, "Ms. Mercer, can you describe your relationship with your grandfather in the year prior to his passing?" I replied, "Consistent. Deeply respectful. Built on shared values." He smiled like a man expecting resistance. "And would you describe yourself as emotionally close?" "Yes." "Closer than his daughter, your mother?" "I can't speak to their closeness." "But you were with him more often?" "Yes." "And during those visits, did he ever express concern about the future of the business?" "He expressed intention." Walling raised an eyebrow. "Intention?" "He wanted to ensure the business would be preserved, not liquidated. He believed I understood the infrastructure and values better than anyone else." "And you agreed?" I paused. I agreed with his assessment. "Yes." He walked slowly, theatrically, to the exhibit table. "And is it true that you were aware, prior to his death, that the estate had been left solely to you?" "Yes." "Is it also true that you did not inform your mother or siblings?" I looked directly at him. That wasn't my place. He blinked. Mr. Beckett didn't object once. He knew I didn't need protection. I told the truth. Calmly. Quietly. Every word a brick. When they finished, Patricia's attorney requested a break. The judge allowed it. In the hallway, Rachel approached me. Her heels clicked too loudly against the tile. She said, "You could still split it, you know." Quietly. Save everyone the embarrassment. I looked at her, really looked at her, the glossed lips, the practiced pout, the faint crease in her brow that always deepened when she was bluffing. I replied, "You already chose your side." She scoffed. "This isn't about sides." But of course, it was. It always had been. Back in the courtroom, Patricia was called to testify. She entered the witness stand like it was a stage, spine straight, expression perfectly curated. Her voice was warm, laced with just enough sadness to feel sincere. She spoke of memory, of family dinners, of traditions long past. She said, "My father always said family comes first. I don't think he would have wanted this." Beckett rose slowly. No notes. He asked only one question, "Mrs. Carter, did you ask Mr. Mercer, 2 weeks before his death, to liquidate 3 of his stores to cover a personal investment debt?" She faltered. Just slightly. I discussed options. But you did ask? There was a pause. Yes. That was enough. The judge recessed for deliberation. 60 minutes. I waited in silence. Beckett sat beside me, hands steepled. "You've already won," he said softly. Regardless of her decision. But I hadn't. Not yet. Because I wasn't fighting for the money. I was fighting for the right to remember him without distortion. And in that moment, the door opened. The judge returned. And everything shifted. The room was silent when the judgment was read, not out of respect, but disbelief. Her voice didn't rise. The judge didn't deliver some grand pronouncement. She simply confirmed what I already knew in my bones: the will was valid, the motion to invalidate was denied, and control of the estate remained as Harold Mercer intended. Every word felt like a hinge falling into place. The attorneys nodded. A few exchanged clipped thank yous. Mr. Beckett shook my hand with the same composed firmness he'd maintained through everything. Patricia stood motionless. Her face didn't register shock or defeat, just the hollow neutrality of someone who had not anticipated a world where she didn't win. Outside the courthouse, the air felt strangely still. There were no reporters. No dramatic exits. Just people walking past, unaware of the shift that had taken place. But something had shifted. Not just legally. Not just financially. Something internal. It was over, at least on paper. But what came next was never the part people warned you about. The fallout wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, and strangely procedural. My mother's lawyers filed the expected statement of disagreement, a shallow gesture meant to save face. Rachel posted a filtered photo of a sunset with a caption about letting go of bitterness. Jason didn't say a word. Not to me. Not to anyone, as far as I could tell. And I didn't celebrate. I went home, removed my shoes, and sat on the floor. The boxes of documents were still there, untouched since the night before the hearing. I could have thrown them out. Burned them, even. But I didn't. I left them there, lined against the wall like sentries. There was dignity in remembering. There was dignity in silence, too. In the weeks that followed, the estate transferred fully into my name. The official paperwork arrived in a thick, padded envelope. It had weight. It had finality. And yet, the grief arrived late. Not for my family, I had already buried that illusion, but for the end of a chapter that, for better or worse, had defined so much of who I had been. I returned to the flagship store first. Not as a guest. Not as someone visiting their grandfather's legacy. but as its steward. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I wanted to see it as it was. The paint needed refreshing. A window in the back office stuck when pulled. But the heartbeat was still there, the rhythm of customers, the quiet clatter of inventory checks, the hum of fluorescent lights and human effort. Mark greeted me with a look of cautious curiosity. He said, "So, now what?" I replied, "Now we keep it running. The way he built it. Just better." I wasn't planning major changes. No renovations, no rebranding. Grandpa had always believed in efficiency over reinvention. What needed fixing was subtle, the processes behind the storefront, the trust that had been frayed by months of gossip and power plays. I started small. A quiet meeting with the general managers from all 3 states. No fanfare, no formal agenda. Just a roundtable at a modest hotel conference room with black coffee and plain donuts. I spoke for less than 10 minutes. I told them what would not change. Then I asked them what they needed. Not what they wanted, what they needed. That distinction mattered. One manager teared up when I approved a modest budget request for staff development that had been denied for years. Another simply said, he'd be proud. Those words landed heavier than any legal victory. Because legal victories fix paperwork. But this fixed the legacy. Meanwhile, the family went quiet. Patricia didn't call. I hadn't expected her to. But I'd expected something. A dig. A performance. An invitation to rewrite the narrative in her favor. It never came. Instead, she sent a handwritten note. It was brief. "I hope you understand what you've done." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have an answer. But because I had already chosen mine in court. Rachel resurfaced weeks later, not to apologize but to reposition. She emailed a vague offer to collaborate on some kind of charitable initiative under Grandpa's name. She attached a branding mock-up and offered to manage the PR. I forwarded it to Mr. Beckett without comment. Jason sent nothing. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a notification on social media that he'd started a new position at an automotive chain. I watched it all from a distance. Not detached, but resolved. Because I no longer needed their approval. I needed the work. And there was plenty of it. Tax season approached quickly. Mr. Beckett helped me select a small, highly vetted accounting firm that specialized in succession transitions. I met with them twice, brought in the ledgers from the store's early years, the ones Grandpa had meticulously maintained by hand. I told them I wanted full audits. Not because I didn't trust the books, but because I needed the clarity. Clarity protects legacy. One evening, while reviewing supplier contracts at my desk, I found myself tracing Grandpa's old margin notes with my index finger. He had the habit of scribbling calculations in the corners of every document, a quirk he never gave up, even in the digital age. I smiled. Then I opened a new spreadsheet, titled it, Mercer Ledger, and began typing. There was no music. No audience. Just quiet work. That's how it's supposed to be. By spring, the staff at the stores had stopped whispering. The trust had slowly begun to return. Employees started bringing me small things, ideas, suggestions, even old stories about Grandpa I'd never heard. I wrote them down. All of them. Some in a notebook. Some on sticky notes I kept in a box labeled Mercer History. Because someday, someone else might need to remember, too. Closure, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the form of rhythm. Routine. Small repairs. Balanced budgets. Uninterrupted sleep. But there was one thing still undone. One place I hadn't returned to. The house. The childhood home where the ambush began. It wasn't mine. It was still under Patricia's name, though I knew they were behind on property taxes. I drove past it once, slowly. The porch had chipped. The lawn had overgrown. A mailbox hung crooked at the hinge. It looked forgotten. But it wasn't. I remembered every corner. Every Sunday dinner. Every fight, every silence. I parked across the street and sat for a long time. Not to confront. Not to reclaim. Just to release it. Then I drove away. And as I turned onto the main road, I felt something loosen inside me. Something quiet. Something final. Some endings don't need doors slammed or names shouted, they just require the decision to stop turning back. That was the last time I saw the house. I didn't look in the rearview mirror when I left. There wasn't anything there I hadn't already carried with me and finally set down. I thought the ache would linger, but it didn't. Not in the way I expected. Grief, when honored properly, doesn't beg for attention. It just shifts into quiet space inside you, where it stops asking to be solved. I began to understand something I hadn't before: survival is not the same as healing. I had survived this family, their silence, their resentment, their attempts to rewrite everything I'd lived and built with my grandfather. But healing came slowly, not from court rulings or settlements, but from smaller things. Things no one applauds. Like reading through Grandpa's ledgers not because I had to anymore, but because I wanted to hear his thoughts. Like approving a raise for a store manager who had held the place together while we were all in courtrooms and conference calls. Like walking into the flagship store on a Thursday morning and hearing someone laugh, really laugh, near aisle 6. That's what healing sounds like. It didn't come all at once. But piece by piece, the legacy began to feel like something alive again, not something under attack. I stopped checking for mentions of my name in the family group threads I was no longer part of. I unsubscribed from Rachel's curated updates, stopped opening emails with her signature branding pitch. I never responded to the message she sent 6 months later with the subject line, "Reconnection?" There was no anger left to fuel a reply. There was simply nothing to say. Not because nothing had happened, but because everything had. I learned that peace doesn't require the other person to admit they were wrong. It only requires that you stop waiting for them to. In the spring, I began drafting a proposal for a community initiative, something Grandpa and I had talked about years ago but never put into action. A training program for underemployed teens from rural areas. A partnership with local trade schools. The kind of project that doesn't make headlines, but changes someone's Tuesday afternoon. I didn't name it after him. He would have hated that. I just called it Margin. After the notebook. After the idea that everyone deserves room to breathe, to build a life without having to defend their worth every day. When I presented it to the board, there was no resistance. Just quiet approval. A few nods. A simple vote. It passed. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, lights off, binder open, coffee cooling beside me, and felt something I hadn't in years. Pride. Not inherited. Not projected. Earned. The letters kept arriving, even as the months passed. Employees sharing memories. Customers recalling old conversations with Grandpa at checkout counters. Former vendors reminiscing about his stubbornness in negotiations and his loyalty once earned. I kept every one. I started writing them back. Not long responses, just enough to say, "I heard you. He mattered. You mattered." Olivia came to visit that summer. We sat on the patio of a small cafe and watched the traffic drift by in lazy streaks of gold and gray. She said, "You're different." I replied, "I'm the same. Just not exhausted anymore." She smiled and lifted her glass. "To Harold," she said. But I raised mine and said, "To letting go without letting them win." Because that's what it really was. Not revenge. Not even justice. Just the refusal to let them define the ending. Sometimes I drive with the windows down now. Just to feel the air without filters. Sometimes I visit stores without notice. I walk in like a regular customer, pick up a screwdriver or a light bulb, and stand in line. Sometimes, I overhear someone mention Harold's name, casually, like he's still around. And in those moments, I smile. Because in a way, he is. Not in plaques or photos. But in systems that still function. In people who still remember what working for him felt like. In the quiet, unspoken standards that were never written down, just lived. A year after the ruling, I sat down and wrote one last letter. I didn't send it. It was for me. Grandpa. They tried to take what you built. Not just the business. You. Your voice. Your judgment. They failed. I didn't fight to win. I fought to protect what already belonged to both of us. I hope that's enough. I hope I was enough. Love. Amber. I folded it and placed it inside the third ledger, the one labeled lessons. Then I closed the cover. And for the first time in years, I exhaled. The story was never about inheritance. It was about ownership. And now, it was finally mine.